A production of KCTS, Seattle. This program was made possible in part by a grant from the Washington Commission for the Humanities.
This is Trident, hailed as the mightiest deterrent to a nuclear attack yet devised. Is it the Supersub of the future?
I think it's more important than a B-1 bomber as a credible and effective deterrent.
Survivability and stability make it a good weapon, and probably the most popular weapon in our arsenal today.
The Soviet strategic nuclear capability had overtaken our own, and that if the Soviets were going to be restrained to any degree at all, it was going to take some new system like the Trident submarine.
Is Trident a super sub, or might it be a dinosaur?
We have today over 5,000 nuclear weapons in our submarine force. And the sole purpose of those 5,000 nuclear weapons in our submarines is to shoot at the Soviet Union. So it's just ridiculous to add still another system like the Trident.
It's unnecessary, it's redundant, it's worthless, it's unusable because if it's ever used, we're all dead.
So in a sense, I think the likelihood is that Trident will become, as the ABM has become, a kind of dinosaur.
Trident, at present under construction, is our newest generation of strategic nuclear missile submarines, designed to replace the current fleet of 41 Polaris Poseidon subs. This is Polaris. Trident will be almost twice its size, almost 2 football fields in length. With the latest submarine technology, Trident will have a longer lifespan, be more easily repairable, and can stay at sea longer than its predecessors. Designers say it will also be quieter. Perhaps most important, Trident will have a new longer-range missile, Trident 1.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
T0.
Fire.
Roger, approach and ignition. Out.
Each submarine will carry 24 Trident 1 missiles, and each missile will in turn be fitted with from 5 to 10 nuclear warheads, MIRVed so they can be independently aimed at separate targets. A single warhead will have at least 6 times the destructive force of the Hiroshima bomb. One sub could destroy any country on Earth. The 4,000-mile range of the Trident 1 missile will give the submarine the capacity to strike Russian targets from directly off the Pacific coast. If necessary, even from home port at Bangor. These same new missiles will also be carried on the Poseidon subs, one reason why critics say the Trident sub is unnecessary. The keel was laid for the first Trident, the Ohio, this past spring. It will arrive at Bangor in early '79. Costs have escalated 35% in the last 2 years, and should the B-1 program be cut, Trident will be the most expensive weapon system yet developed by the U.S. Each sub is costing roughly $1.8 billion, $18.8 billion for the 10. Overall, Trident is considered by many to be our best, our most survivable strategic weapon for the next several decades. My name is Gordon Wilcox. I was asked by the producers to do the interviews in this show because they wanted somebody without a point of view on Trident and who wasn't a regular TV person. Throughout this program, I was surprised and pleased that I could say what I wanted to and ask the questions I wanted to. I began with a look at the Bangor base across Puget Sound from Seattle. $600 million of construction is in progress preparing for Trident. The base has for years serviced Polaris subs, but now Bangor will be the only base in the world training crews and servicing the Trident fleet. Over 25% of all nuclear warheads in the U.S. arsenal will be carried in the planned 11 Trident subs. I wondered about having Trident so close to a metropolitan area and whether it makes us a prime target.
Well, Gordon, I would not think that it would make you any more of a target than really Seattle or that state of Washington has today.
There's no way to defend Bangor, but Bangor is going to be the prime target in the country.
After having spent a few years in the strategic targeting business myself, I would say that if the Russians have not already scheduled at least a dozen or so weapons in this area, they're displaying far less intelligence than I give them credit for. And when any new threat comes in, naturally you put more weapons on it.
There's no question the Puget Sound area is already a target, but we also now have the only base in the world serving this incredible deterrent force called Trident. We are officially classified a Category 1 counterforce target. It's something we don't want to talk about or think about. And it seems the Navy certainly doesn't like questions being asked about it. I was interested when I visited the base to find their public affairs officer visibly uncomfortable talking about nuclear weapons on that base.
Lieutenant, you've told me this is where the missiles will be for the training?
Well, at this end of the building, there will be missile tubes installed, plus missiles in them, yes.
And they have everything in them but the fuel and the nuclear device?
Well, they won't have fuels, and I don't know anything about nuclear devices. That's just an area that I don't get into.
Is that just classified information?
Well, by government law, I can't confirm or deny the presence of a nuclear weapon, and beyond that, I have no way of knowing.
That's that sub has armed missiles on it, doesn't it?
I have no way of knowing that.
Well, you know, if it's out there on patrol, I guess I can make the assumption myself that it wouldn't be much good if it didn't.
Seeing the Trident base can't help but bring home a bit more what nuclear war means. The kind of strike that could occur in the Puget Sound area, with Bangor as one of the many targets, has several scenarios. For instance, Boeing technicians think it's likely a 1 megaton airburst would hit. 1 megaton is over 50 times more than the Hiroshima bomb. Within 7 miles, burns would be deadly. At 20 miles, 100-mile-an-hour winds, windows blown out, buildings damaged. But civil defense people think it's possible a 20 megaton bomb may hit. Such a blast would incinerate the base. Within 9 miles, people would die of burns. At 18 miles, they would be seriously injured and burned. And 50 miles away, windows would be blown out and buildings damaged. Boeing's scenario is based on an airburst, which means no radioactive fallout results. However, this presumes perfect accuracy. If it is a land or a sea burst, fallout would be enormous, even for a 1 megaton bomb. The dangerous radioactive particles, called fallout, would begin to spread out, varying according to wind speed, direction, and weather. Civil defense authorities gave a computer readout on January 20th, Inauguration Day, which would produce this fallout pattern for the Puget Sound region for a 1 megaton blast. In the first hour, 10 minutes of radiation exposure would cause sickness. 40 minutes would be fatal. Each succeeding hour, as fallout spreads, it's still dangerous, depending on how long the person is exposed. Our knowledge of what severe radiation poisoning means comes from the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Victims experience severe bleeding, loss of hair, and death usually follows within a few weeks. There's a lot of material available from the regional civil defense people concerning civil defense preparedness, and I was interested to know whether or not any special plans were being made now that Trident is in the area. I spoke with Leland Daly, Director of the Department of Emergency Services, Kitsap County Civil Defense.
What kind of shelters are there ready around here, Mr. Daly?
Well, in the county, we have approximately 60 shelters. Now, I say approximately because building is going on, and as substantial buildings are built, we add that to our shelter inventory. We have had one thing a little unique in this county. We have licensed some of the reserve ships for shelters. Now, every now and then, they'll take one of these reserve ships and scrap it. So that is reducing our shelter inventory. But it usually is right around the 60 mark. Now,
you told me a bit earlier when you were showing me one of the actual license packages that that they don't necessarily have signs posted at the moment, but you could get them posted.
Well, now, most of our shelters that are licensed do have signs. Now, some of the people prefer not to have the sign there, and we don't argue with them on that.
What would you do in the case of a strike?
Well, our program, there again, presupposes that if a strike is inevitable, there will be some indications that there will be some time for taking last-minute preparations.
How much time?
We don't know. We don't know. But we are assuming that there will be some time. Now, we have a supply of shelter marking material on hand. It wouldn't take long for us to commandeer a few people to help us and go mark all our shelters in a day or two.
Mr. Daly, if you just had 30 seconds in which you were trying to say the most important thing to anybody who might watch this program about preparedness for a limited nuclear strike at Bangor, what would you tell them?
What I would tell the people is this. I would simply give them the bad news. There's no reason not to.
There is conflicting opinion among authorities on surviving a nuclear strike. Experts at Boeing feel there's no question we could survive. They base their thinking on the Russians' approach.
Well, the best defense against a nuclear weapon of any kind is to be somewhere else when it goes off. And as long as people can move prior to a war, simply walk out into the small towns and the collective farms, which is the Russian plan, there's no way.
But it's not the way our population's distributed.
Well, the way the population is distributed in peacetime and the way the Russians plan to distribute theirs in wartime are not the same. They plan to move their people out and distribute them over a wide area. Therefore, they cannot be targeted.
Do we have a plan like that?
No, we do not.
Should we?
Yes, we should.
Well, you've added another thing for me to worry about now, TK.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily worry about it. I've told you how you can survive, and for $6.50 you can buy the world's best survival manual from the Department of Commerce. It's a translation of the Russian civil defense text.
Take a city like Seattle or Tacoma. If you try at rush hour to get everybody out at the same time, you have a big problem. So I don't see how you can possibly get people out in a real emergency. But even if you got them out of the city, and that's what this current plan is, to evacuate people weeks in advance, put them out in the country, what are you going to do with them? How are you going to feed them? Even if you don't have an attack. But then after the attack, nuclear weapons today are so destructive that they will pollute the water system, they'll pollute the soil.
If you look at the photographs of Hiroshima, you get awe-stricken with the extent of destruction, and people turn it off. They declare it unthinkable and they put it out of their mind. But if you look at those same photographs, the way the Russians have looked at them, you see that things did survive. For example, one day after the bomb in Hiroshima, the bridges into the downtown area were open to traffic. 2 days later, the trains started to run again.
The nuclear exchange is more than just killing so many million people. It's taking the world as we know it and changing it in very profound ways. For example, nuclear exchange almost certainly would wipe out the ozone layer in the atmosphere. That would mean that over the world, not only in the affected areas, but worldwide, you would have very severe ultraviolet radiation penetrating to the surface and destroying life as we know it.
Now, if indeed it gets to the point where the Soviet Union and the United States are tossing missiles at each other, either one or a whole volley, there isn't any place that's going to be safe. No place, really. And by that time, you've passed so many milestones and so many clear-cut indications that the situation is deteriorating that I don't think anybody could really delude themselves that they were going to be safe. If we want to maintain a stable nuclear balance in the future that will assure that we are not endangered by a nuclear strike, then we're going to need the Trident. Now, if on the other hand you're going to say, well, we're really too nervous about the notion that we might get hit, we'd rather not have the base here, somebody else should do it. There really isn't any other place to put it that I've heard. And if you say, well, we are too nervous about being a target, it really doesn't matter if the Trident program is that much delayed because we don't want to be a target. Well, in my opinion, you heighten the possibility of destabilizing that whole delicate balance because you are going to delay a Trident program that is essential to stabilizing the balance in future and making sure that you don't get to the point where missiles are being tossed across the world.
Given the overwhelming impact of Trident on this area, it's surprising how little is known about the decision-making process to place it here. Walter Heller has a summer home here on the Hood Canal near Bangor, and as a former economic advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, he has an insider's view of how the political process works and has been a long-time critic of Trident.
If you talk about the decision process, let me say that's one place where I really have some question, real deep question about how the thing was handled. You know, they had heard in North Florida and in South Carolina that the Trident missile might be located there, Trident missile, Trident submarine base. And there was a public outcry, and it didn't happen. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen because there was the public outcry, but the fact remains, A, there was a public outcry, B, it wasn't put down there. Now, what about C? What about the advance notice that it might be put in Bangor? Well, I was directly involved in that. And I talked to Senator Jackson's office. His office had been very good about keeping us informed concerning the possible expansion of the base for entirely different reasons, having nothing to do. This is pre-Trident. And so when I began to hear that Trident submarine base might possibly be located out here, I heard it as a single rumor from a single person. I called Jackson's office, and I asked, no, they said, 1 chance in 100. And bang, after, so to speak, people were, what shall I say, defanged, if you will, by this information. People who had begun to worry about it said, well, you know, 1 in 100, those are pretty good odds. And so no public protest was mounted at all. And no chance for protest was granted. All of a sudden, one day, the thunderclap sounded, and $20 billion worth of boats were being put in our midst.
Quite frankly, Senator Jackson, as chairman of the Senate, I mean, not chairman, but as one of the ranking members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was kind of following the decision for the delegation. And I can tell you that within 7 days, the time the decision was made, Senator Jackson's staff was convinced that it would not be in Puget Sound. They thought it was going to go to Charleston, South Carolina. And as far as I know, no member of our congressional delegation had any was consulted in advance. Maybe Senator Jackson was, I don't know that directly, but I know that Senator Magnuson and Congressman Hicks were not, and they would be the 2 people involved, were not consulted in advance about the final decision to locate there.
I never asked that it go there. They made that decision, and the witnesses have so testified. Admiral Zumwalt, who was then in charge, so testified. And it was the only location that was available on the West Coast, and they wanted Trident located in the Pacific.
You changed your vote from the committee discussions to the floor discussions on the Benson Amendment, which would have slowed down the development of Trident. Can you tell me what your concerns were about the speed at which the program has gone forward?
Well, initially, the view was that we could go at a slower pace. That was based on certain assumptions as to what the Soviets were doing. And I became convinced that we did need to accelerate it.
A decision was made to put the base in state of Washington,
And it just so happens that Senator Jackson, who was against the program initially, changed his vote. Now, I don't know whether there's any connection between the two, but there's, and I don't mean to imply that Senator Jackson put pressure on them to do it, but that he didn't have to. I think what happened was that the Pentagon would have clearly recognized that without Jackson's support, the Trident program would never have gone to sea. I mean, it just never would have taken off. And so Jackson's vote was absolutely crucial, and I think probably one of the things was, what can we do without being pushed by Senator Jackson? What can we do to make sure that he won't vote against us? And one thing, of course, was to put the base in the state of Washington. Senator Jackson denies he had anything to do with it, and I think that's probably true, but you don't have to have had anything to do with it. The guys over there, they know. They know what it takes.
Admiral Zumwalt was Chief of Naval Operations when key decisions were made on Trident. I asked him how you get such a program through Congress.
Well, you do it by dog hard work and with the help of some magnificent members of the Senate, the most important of which is your own Senator Scoop Jackson, whose assistance was the sine qua non for saving the Trident at a time when it survived a 49 to 47 vote as part of a major effort first to cut it back and then later to kill it. He told me while the studies were going on that all things being equal, he would just soon not have that base located in Washington. After we had completed the study and it was clear that from a strategic standpoint, for a number of reasons, this was by all odds the best place to put it, I went back to him and reported it to him, and he said, all right, if that's what's required for the country, then I'll support it. We informed him as soon as we knew, because obviously Senator Jackson's support is critical to anything like that, and he was the kind of a patriotic person that was willing to put the country's interests above his own political interests.
So I learned a little more about how a weapon system such as Trident passes through the halls of Congress and the Pentagon. And I found right here in Seattle someone with a unique perspective on the whole process and the problems of getting information. Rick Redmond, as former legislative assistant to Senator Magnuson, worked on a study of weapon systems and gave me one example of the kind of problems he had getting information.
One that I remember most vividly had to do with the Navy's attempt to expand the base over at Bangor on Hood Canal starting in the fall of 1968. And I was a very, very young legislative assistant at that time, but I had an interest in this because it happened that my parents lived very close to the base. So when Senator Magnuson said we ought to find out why they were trying to expand it, I volunteered for the assignment. This was before I had my top secret clearance. And I spent a long, long time working with the Navy, trying to get them to explain why they wanted to acquire more land, why they wanted to expand that base. And they had several different explanations, and none of them seemed to make very much sense. One involved whether or not the site where they kept the explosives, if an explosion occurred, would it reach out and hit the civilian population? Well, when we looked at their charts, it looked as if for a lower cost than acquiring all the land, they could just relocate the site where they had the explosives on the base and solve that problem. And about the time I made that suggestion, they started saying that there was some stuff I couldn't know because I didn't have a top secret clearance. I had not yet gotten my clearance. So I went through the process of applying for the clearance to find out what it was that they weren't going to let me know without the clearance, and it took, quite a while to get the clearance, 4 or 5 months. And when I did get the clearance, I then started asking the questions again. And suddenly, now that I had the clearance, there were no plans at all. There was nothing that I couldn't know about. They'd already told me everything before as far as they were concerned. And in frustration, I walked down the hall to the office of another senator and to talk to one of his assistants whom I had been working with on this problem. And I walked in, and there was the assistant, just happened to be standing there with a chart of Bangor, of the base. And on the chart, drawn in dashed lines, was a new pier, a pier that didn't exist. And I said to him, what is this pier which you have drawn in on this chart, which I've never been unable to find out about? He said, that's not a pier, those are just lines on the chart. And I said, come on, tell me what this pier is about. And he wouldn't tell me, and I went home. This was in summer of 1969, before anyone had heard of Trident. And I just concluded that they had some plans for some sort of missiles on that base that they weren't going to tell anyone about. They weren't going to tell me, even though I had the clearance, and even though Senator Magnuson wanted to find out.
Can't find out unless the Pentagon decides it wants to tell you.
If it's classified. If it is classified.
Who makes the decision to classify?
The Pentagon.
And so, Kitsap County got the base. The impact on the area has been staggering, with about 40,000 new people who will be needing housing, schools, water, sewer systems, and other social services. It's been a drastic change for what had been a rural, peaceful area. According to the Navy, 92% of the people they've talked to like having the base nearby. However, Dale Mills, writer for the Seattle Times, had this to say about local support.
There's a coalition, really, here between the Chamber of Commerce and the Navy, which is working very well for both of them. 11 chambers of commerce in this area and the Navy are working to promote this project here, and both gain from it. The chambers of commerce, people who sell goods and who sell oil and who sell whatever, of course gain from having a huge influx of people. And so they are saying that it's going to bring prosperity and that we need it for our national defense.
Mr. William Dane is the former chairman of the Puget Sound Chamber of Commerce Task Force on Trident.
As a chamber member, I just happen to make a comment. We ought to take a stand and come out and in behalf of the program of Trident. Because remember, our mission is to get the facts and present them as we see them on the pro side and offset the opposing phases of the construction. And of course, none of us, that I know of, that I've been working with, are interested to disrupt the community landscape-wise or dirty air or anything. But we also realize we have to have a defense. Being a Navy town, of course, we're very friendly and we like them here. They've been very good to the community. And I think they like it too.
The aspect of there being a larger number of nuclear weapons, both there and in transit through there, does not concern you, I take it?
Well, it doesn't concern me because I have confidence in the people handling these things to take all the precautions necessary.
But some people don't have such confidence in the Navy. Concerned about Trident is a group of citizens who have been critical of Trident in general and have filed several lawsuits. They were recently encouraged by a court decision which said the Navy had to follow the Environmental Protection Act and take a fresh look at its selection of the base and its long-term environmental effect on the Puget Sound area. The court, however, did not stop work on the base. I spoke with Mr. Eberharder, president of the group. How much money have you spent on the litigation you supported?
Personally, I've spent about $11,000.
That's a big chunk of dough.
Yes, it is a big chunk of money. And, but I think it's worth it. I think a person has to do what he thinks is right with his money, and I think that both lawsuits that I've supported have been well worthwhile.
Would you accept a contract to do some of the work at Trident?
No.
Why?
Because I don't believe in it. I don't believe it's something that should be done over there.
And you're a professional contractor and generally do the work on a profit basis.
That's right.
Look at the profit.
I don't think I have to do work at Trident in order to make a living. And even if I did, I wouldn't.
You've got a depth of feeling about this, which has made you learn some stuff about the weapon systems, which you didn't initially know, from what you're saying. Where does your depth of feeling come from? What singles you out?
Well, I don't know if I'm all that unique. There are a lot of people that are against the Trident system. Also, you have to realize that a lot of people feel that once the decision has been made to go ahead with something like this, and the wheels are in motion, the money has been obligated by the government, the decision has been made to go ahead, that you're really wasting your time trying to fight it. And they might be right.
A group with a very different approach to opposing Trident is the Pacific Life Community.
I and 2 other women went to the base at Bangor and in 5 separate occasions cut the fence in an attempt to begin dismantling the base directly. We took out, on each occasion, from 25 to 150 feet of fence. We were first given barring letters, then citations, and finally arrested and taken to jail. And we consider each act of resistance to be life-affirming, but actions involving property damage have to be explained in a way that we can lead people to an understanding that there is some property which is intrinsically illegitimate. I would say the ovens at Dachau, okay, that anyone who took the doors off that oven would be doing a service, a positive service toward life. I think, as in the case of the Vietnam War, that if I'm to communicate my real concern about this system, then I have to communicate that by putting my life against it. And that as we in our community are able to risk more, that other people will understand our immense concern and then begin to say, why are these people so concerned? For instance, I live in a community, but I have 2 very young children, one 4 and a half and one 6. And I really love my children. I really do. These are important years for me to be with my children. And for me personally, it's a heavy decision. And for each of the women involved in this action are mothers, one a single mother. For each of us, it was a really important decision to take a risk that would separate us from our children.
Going to jail.
Going to jail. In this case, the risk we face for the last action is 1 year and $1,000 for each of the 2 counts of destruction of property that we're charged with. Now, why would I personally take that risk? It's only because I think my children have no future if that base is here.
And at the congressional level, there was one lone voice in the state of Washington in opposition to Trident, Representative Joel Pritchard.
Joel, you were the only member of the Washington State delegation to vote against Trident. How did that come to be?
Well, I just wasn't satisfied that the Trident program was, the way they had put it up, was in the best interest of the country, and I had some serious questions, so I voted against it.
Did that have anything to do with Trident being located here in our state?
Not really. I think that if you think a program is necessary for the security of the nation, why, I think then we have to accept it if this is the best place for it. No, I opposed it on the basis that I thought we were going into a crash program. We hadn't completed the research and development. And I had serious questions whether we wouldn't have been better off if we had just refitted the Poseidon and Polaris with the new missiles. They have great retaliatory power. One Polaris sitting in the Great Lakes, it's my understanding, can destroy every Russian city of 100,000 and over. I just think that that the timing is wrong, and I wish Congress had been slower and given it more thought. We have to have sufficiency in our defense structure, and certainly the submarine is probably the most effective retaliatory weapon we have. No question about that. So when you take those 2 factors, why, of course, it's very hard for, I think, for many people to stand up and question this program.
And it is hard to question Trident. This was the Navy's reply when we first asked to have a spokesman participate in a studio dialogue. Quote, "We regret that we must decline. Such discussion often results in debate." Unquote. But after many weeks of phone calls and letters, persistence paid off, and I went to the Pentagon and was able to talk to Rear Admiral Kelm about the importance of Trident.
We have built the Trident submarine to not only accommodate the longer-range missile, but we've incorporated all of the technology which we've developed during the past 26 years since Polaris was first designed, such that we have a much quieter platform that is a much more difficult platform for any ASW adversary to find and to neutralize.
Anti-submarine warfare.
Anti-submarine warfare. We have incorporated technology such that we can spend longer periods at sea. We have developed within the Trident system, we have a missile tube which can accommodate a larger missile should someday that be in the national interest to develop. We have primarily put our effort in the thing that I and you as a taxpayer are interested in, is to try to find the most cost-effective combination of a submarine versus the number of missiles that it carries. And though we've been criticized really without foundation, but we've been criticized that we have too many missile launchers on a submarine, our cost-effectiveness studies indicate that having 24 missiles on the Trident submarine is by far the most cost-effective option than producing more submarines with lesser numbers of missiles.
How many Tridents are now planned?
Currently, the shipbuilding program is, the Trident shipbuilding program has an indefinite number of submarines. The final number will be a product of the deliberations of Congress, the considerations that we have in the Department of Defense. It will be a function of our success in SALT discussions and negotiations, and so it would be it would not be right for me to even conjecture or speculate what ultimate number it might be.
I really have enjoyed this, and I really do think that the information and the answers you've given me really say something, and they say something that I can understand. But I have not had that experience the whole way through in trying to get information, and that includes, sir, trying to get information from the Navy. I have to say that as directly as possible because I'd like you to respond to it.
I'm not making excuses for the Navy, but I think that the desire is there. I think that, for instance, the Trident program, we've tried to be very forthright. We've put all the cards on the table on the base selection, on the capabilities of the ship, the capabilities of the missile, and therefore we enjoy credibility and the confidence of the people.
However, the Pentagon is sharply scrutinized by a group of defense analysts and former high military officers in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Defense Information.
What information do you put out for the public, and how do you get it?
Well, we use published sources. There's a lot of information available, but it takes a good deal of expertise to dig it out of congressional hearings, to dig it out of statements from the Pentagon. You have to learn to read between the lines a little. And after having spent 7 years in the Pentagon, I can tell when they are dissembling and when they are distorting or when they are leaving things out.
Is Trident a good system for defending the United States?
Sure, it's a good system. The only thing is you don't need it. We already have more than enough in our Polaris and Poseidon submarines, in our manned bombers, and in our land-based ICBMs. Specifically, we have today over 5,000 nuclear weapons in our submarine force. The head of the program in the Navy, Admiral Kaufman, was quoted a couple of years ago as saying that one of our current Poseidon submarines, just one submarine, could destroy 160 Soviet cities, one submarine. We already have 41 strategic submarines, so it makes no sense, in my opinion, to add another 10 or 11. It's actually open-ended. That's the other bad thing about this Trident program. The Navy initially came in and asked for 1 or 2, saying they wanted a program of 10 max. Now they've said they want 11, and that just keeps it open-ended. Here again, the public doesn't know and isn't being told not only why do we need them, but what is the extent of the program.
Before going to talk to Senator McIntyre, the chairman of a key subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee, I reviewed a number of volumes of that committee's hearings. This is just one volume. And began to see how hard it is for anybody, including the senators, to get all the information. Not only is there an awful lot of information, but a great deal of it is written in nonsensical language. In front of me is a long discussion of something called a known unknown, which Senator McIntyre points out is an improved term over one he heard before, unk-unk. He went on with a lot of humor in the hearings about trying to make things understandable and frequently asked people to just talk to him in plain language.
I asked the senator, can the average person understand the issues of nuclear defense policy?
the simplistic answer is so easy for the fellow on the street, the guy down at the pharmacy, the fellow at the local hot dog counter. All he says, now, Tom, I want you to keep us strong. Well, we want to be strong. We don't want to be number 3. If we're number 3 or number 2, we might as well be number 36. But there's more to that than giving the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force every damn thing they want. And they want everything.
Well, Senator, don't good questions make for a better product in the end?
I hope so. I hope so. It really isn't a product, but yes, it is in a product. To go back to Trident, the argument that I had with Trident, and the one we took to the floor, and the one we almost prevailed in committee, was that they wanted to build it too fast. Now, a good product, we have found, comes by being careful and going ahead at a pace that is reasonable. The Navy at that time, under the push of a real strong Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Zumwalt, he wanted to put that submarine, the Trident, I think, in a package that would be 1 the first year and then 3, 3, 3. 10 of them. Bang. We said, look, our experience has been that when you get in going that fast and you have a retrofit, you cost Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer, you cost them millions, sometimes billions of dollars to make up for your mistakes. So we would like to see you build them at a slower pace. And that was the debate. And we lost.
How does Trident and the development of Trident relate to the arms race and the potential or lack of potential for disarmament?
Well, the Trident submarine, of course, represents a very important part of our security system. And I've always liked the Trident submarine as a weapon because it was a stable weapon and it was a survivable weapon. So its survivability and its stability make it a good weapon, and probably the most popular weapon in our arsenal today.
Deterrence is based upon one side's ability to inflict unacceptable damage. I think those are the words. On the other side, how much more than X amount of missiles do you need? Do you need to be able to kill everybody twice to have deterrence, or 3 times?
Well, I don't believe we do, but I would say that, that on a vote on the floor of the Senate, if that question was up, that a majority would vote to kill them 3 times more. And they won't do that because they mean to. They only do it because they don't understand the whole complexity of the defense problem any more than that citizen. In the Senate today and in the House today, there are only a few senators and congressmen who sit and live with defense posture, and God knows we're no experts. The middle of the Senate is concerned with the Commerce Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, the Agriculture Committee. There's no time for a senator or a congressman to become a multifaceted expert. He has to rely on the committee that is before managing the bill. And if you look at the composition of the Senate Armed Services Committee, look at the composition of the Defense Subcommittee on Appropriations, you'll find that, by and large, they're pretty conservative, pretty careful, conservative senators and congressmen who would, on balance, say, Tom, we must be number 1 at all costs and regardless of whether the intricacies are understood by all or not. Gordon, you wouldn't believe this. They don't believe we should ask the military any questions. Just give them anything they want. You know, some of them drive me right out of my mind. You know, some of them say, General, did you say we needed 3,000 tanks? Why don't we have 4,000? The Trident vote, interestingly, on the Trident, was an 8-7 vote in my favor in committee. And remember that admiral I told you about, Zumwalt? When he heard that vote was 8-7, what he thought was against his submarine, but which was only to slow the pace of its construction, he got right on that phone. He found my good friend and a great senator, Senator Goldwater, way out in California someplace, flying some plane that he loves to fly, and told him what had happened. Senator Goldwater said, my proxy was voted incorrectly, and I vote with you, Admiral Zumwalt. So I lost, 7-8. Oh, boy, I tell you. We've had good fights.
Well, I tried every year to call on every member of the Congress. I got to most of them. Senator Goldwater was initially reported to have voted against it, and when I called him out on his fishing boat in the Pacific, he reported his proxy had been cast inaccurately. The thing that has always interested me about the discussions and media coverage of defense systems is that when you're sick, you go to a doctor, and you don't check his advice with your banker or your lawyer. You take the doctor's advice. Yet everybody feels they are expert in the field of military weapon systems. I think we could afford much more nearly to take the advice of our doctor with regard to specific systems, and to have Congress and civilian authority lay out the general guidelines as to the general mix and balance, but not to get into the technical details. And I don't think it's possible for a layman ever to be informed in mass about weapon systems any more than you can hope to educate everybody about exotic diseases.
You've been very close to the presidency in this country, and you've seen the decision-making process happen. How come the information really hasn't gotten out, as far as I can see, as I'm learning about this system?
Well, partly, as you're probably learning, is because a lot of people haven't asked. You're learning a lot by asking. There is perhaps a defense mystique in this country. Now, when the Pentagon talks to you, or people from the Pentagon or the Navy talk to you about these decisions, they say, well, look, these are all the subject of very careful congressional hearings, and your representatives in Congress are those who are on the defense committees and so forth, are investigating this, and they hold hearings and so on. But to my mind, I would say that there's been almost in the case of the Trident, almost an inverse ratio between the enormity of the project and the paucity, the tiny public discussion of the project.
Do you think there's been an effort to withhold information here?
And I'm not a great believer in the conspiracy theory of history, or the devil theory. Sure, I suppose now and then somebody must have said, well, the less we talk about it, maybe the better. But I don't think there's been any attempt to purposely bamboozle the public. But the public has not exercised its right to know, and I don't think that the Pentagon and the Navy have, so to speak, facilitated that right, the exercise of that right.
What are the pros and cons of Trident? Is it a Supersub or Dinosaur? Trident can spend up to 70% of its time at sea, a marked improvement over the present Polaris Poseidon fleet. It is also more easily repairable. This is undisputed. A main argument used in favor of Trident is that it will be significantly quieter than the existing fleet. However, the General Accounting Office reports there is substantial risk that the quietness goals may not be achieved. The Trident I missile will have twice the range of the Polaris Poseidon missiles. However, the Trident I missile doesn't need the Trident sub. It can be used on Poseidon submarines. A key reason given for the Trident system was the 6,000-mile range of the planned Trident II missile, which requires the larger sub. But there is no design program per se for this missile. Trident's design makes it the cost-effective way to go. With 24 missiles per sub, fewer subs are required and only one base is needed to serve them. Yet, a smaller sub with the same features could have been built, costing less. Also, the final number of Tridents is still open-ended. And having one base increases the vulnerability of the system. Trident is a hedge against a Soviet breakthrough in anti-submarine warfare. But there's no ASW threat at present, and experts say there's no chance in the foreseeable future. If there's a breakthrough, Trident's huge size could make it more vulnerable than another, smaller sub. Finally, a crucial reason for Trident is that the Polaris Poseidon fleet will be obsolete in a few years. However, several experts dispute this block obsolescence theory for the Polaris Poseidon fleet. We asked one authority, Dr. Herbert Scoville, if he agreed with this argument.
No, I don't agree with that, and furthermore, the Navy's own testimony doesn't agree with that, because the Navy and the Secretary of Defense is proposing to use those same Polaris submarines well into the 1990s. They're not going to phase them out. They're going to use those same submarines, but they're now proposing to put cruise missiles on them when they have more than they're allowed to have of ballistic missiles. This is proves that the Navy doesn't think these submarines are obsolete. They propose to use them. So they were very careful to say one thing in one place and another thing in another, and that kind of thing should not be allowed, they shouldn't be allowed to get away with.
Can an ordinary person make judgments about what kind of weapon systems or whether or not we should have weapon systems?
I think so. I think that there's plenty of information that is potentially able to be made public and which the public can absorb. The technical details really aren't that important. In most cases, the technical details are only shrouded in secrecy because they want to confuse the people and make the public think that they can't make a decision. There are some very fundamental things about decisions in weapons which can be made without detailed knowledge. For example, in the Trident case, doesn't require any technical knowledge to know that if you have 24 missiles in a given submarine and it costs $1.8 billion a piece, you're going to have a smaller number of submarines in your fleet than if you have only 16 missiles and each one only costs $500 million. Ballistic missile submarines are, in my view, the key element in our strategic deterrent force. But Trident is a very poor solution to a follow-on to the existing very good Polaris and Poseidon submarines, which we now have.
At the University of Washington, I talked with Dr. Hans Bethe, who has a unique view on the nuclear age. He headed the theoretical division at Los Alamos, which produced Fat Man, the first atomic bomb.
Is it possible for an ordinary citizen to understand the implications of something like the Trident?
Certainly. It's not difficult to understand. You don't need to be able to design a submarine or to design a nuclear weapon to understand what the effects of such a weapon will be.
Did you see the first Fat Man explosion?
I did. It was quite overwhelming. I was at the distant observation post 20 miles from the explosion. It really was overwhelming. We felt both some sense of achievement and also some sense of horror what this would do to the world.
Do you have any hopes for a de-acceleration of the arms race?
Yes, I do have such hopes. I would like not only to decelerate the arms race, but to reverse it. I see no reason why the United States and Russia each have several thousand missiles. I think a few hundred missiles would be completely safe for each of us.
You know that the commander of each Trident submarine is going to be the third most powerful man in the world. The first most powerful is the President of the United States. The second most powerful one is the head of the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party. The commander of the Trident submarine is going to be the third most powerful man. He's going to be able to wipe out any country on Earth. He's going to have much greater nuclear capability than either Britain or France or China. Why put so much strength in anybody's hand? Canadians are getting awful mad and upset about this. They, in fact, you know, they weren't consulted about putting it so near to the third largest population center in Canada. They weren't consulted at all. It's true, you're doing it on your own territory, but you're bringing this tiger on your land which can tear the Canadians to pieces too. And I know that there's a campaign growing in British Columbia and Western Canada to get the Canadian government to protest to the American government on the grounds of no incineration without representation. This whole nuclear arms race is a race to oblivion. Wake the people up. Wake up, Washington.
We live in a very frightening world at times. The worst thing you can do is to give way to the fear and the anxiety and say, we're just going to have to give up on this and try to make believe it's not out there. We're still pretty much ahead of them in warheads and in technology and accuracy. But as Mr. Berry was pointing out in his talk today, they are catching up at a very impressive rate And unless we start bestirring ourselves and maintaining our lead, they could catch up to us. So the arms arsenals in the world, I think, would start going down if people started feeling safer. Now, how do you manage to do that? I'm not sure. We've been at it for some centuries and haven't come up with particularly good ideas. Maybe good ideas, but it's been hard to put them into practice. I'm not sure I see it happening soon, frankly. I don't see the world becoming a peaceful, happy, united place very rapidly. I think the most we can hope for is being prepared.
The role of Trident, I would say, is a critical part of what is called a triad. I think it's more important than a B-1 bomber as a credible and effective deterrent. I think the real danger in that terrible, unthinkable area of a nuclear holocaust will be by terrorists. I hate to say that, but we've got madmen in the world, and we need to get into the question of nuclear proliferation as much as we need to consider the reduction of strategic arms. But the key is whether the Russians really mean it, is are they willing to build down?
I just feel that we ought to be pushing as hard as we can to come to some agreement. And I think that's where your citizenship could be felt. Look, we have men who are just as smart and generals who are just as able as our Russian counterparts. We ought to be able to field them and field, F-I-E-L-D, get them in the field as in juxtaposition to the Soviets and hammer away until reason predominates and we get a de-escalation of the weaponry. You've seen pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, the missiles and the nuclear warhead that we're talking about now is probably 75 times greater on that mission of 4,000, 3,000 miles to an accuracy of the type I've just described. And that, of course, is not true, accuracy 0. But that's what it seems to me they're trying to achieve. And when you get that, I have argued time and time again before the Senate, now you have a hair trigger on nuclear confrontation.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
T0.
Fire. 1.
On the way. Roger, approaching ignition. Out.
This program was made possible in part by a grant from the Washington Commission for the Humanities. A production of KCTS, Seattle.